Welcome back to the Nutrient Management Seminar Series, presentations for January 25th. Today, I am pleased to welcome Anne Verhallen, who will be presenting on cover crops, an Ontario perspective. Anne is a soil science graduate from the University of Guelph. She has worked for the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs since 1988. Starting as a soil conservation advisor working in Essex and Kent. Currently, Anne works in the area of horticultural soil management with projects in a wide variety of soil management areas such as erosion, compaction, and water management. Promoting the use of cover crops and supporting better soil health are her passion. Thank you very much for presenting today, Anne.
Hello, I'm Anne Verhallen. I'm a soil management specialist with the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs in Ontario, Canada. And today I've been asked to talk about cover crops, and I'm going to give the Ontario perspective. So I always start off with, what is the goal of your cover crop? Where are you going with this? What's your objective? Is it wind and water erosion protection, or is it a little bit more complex, and are you looking for being able to scavenge nutrients or using a legume to create nutrients? Or are we looking at soil structure and soil health? Or are we really just trying to grow some forage and make some grazing land available? There's lots of different aspects of cover crops that can be applied. So here's an example. This is from my home county, Kent County. Some of this area is, well, a lot of it's highly productive soil. Some of it's very sandy, and we used to see, and we still see, some of this kind of thing, a fair bit of wind erosion in this early spring. This is seed corn field. And the reason I got called out there is because of the damage, but in particular because this grower was so pleased with his cover crop that he had used that year. He's using barley on top of his beds that he's grown carrots. So the young carrots are coming up, and we're seeing just a little bit of a lot of protection actually, and just a little bit of cover. Cover crops have been used traditionally with a lot of vegetable crops quite profitably. It's pretty normal procedure using them in things like carrots, onions, potatoes, and of course processing tomatoes that are grown in our area. A lot more interest lately and a lot more effort spent looking at cover crops and soil erosion, and in particular the effect on water quality. It used to be we were a lot more concerned about nitrogen. More recently, we've talked a lot more about phosphorus. So here's some work that was done by the local conservation authority looking at the impact of cover crops on reducing phosphorus concentrations. And they got a reduction of up to 80%. And of course, it was much more important on the steeper slopes than the gentle slopes. And there's more work than this that's out there in Ontario. Dr. Marion McRae has done a fair bit of work at University of Waterloo, in particular on cover crops, because we're a little different. We have a tendency to freeze, and then we'll thaw and freeze and thaw and freeze all winter long. And so that has a little bit different impact on the cover crops and the release of nutrients. However, that said, it's important, but it's not as important as having a cover crop there to at least hold the soil in place and prevent water from taking soil off the field and, of course, adding to water quality issues. I really like this slide. This is one put together by Marty Vermey, one of the agronomists at the Grain Farmers of Ontario. And he was looking at what's that soil worth? If you're looking at what's it worth to keep it on the field. And that's just based on commercial cubic yard of soil and then calculating it out to per acre inch. And when you start thinking about a lot of our soils in Ontario are maybe 4 to 6 inches deep, that the topsoil is, and maybe 8 inches in some areas, but usually in that 4 to 6. That starts to justify some significant cover crop plantings, just because if we can keep the soil there, we can prevent those kinds of losses, and that land is certainly worth a lot of money. One of the other things that really supports using cover crops is a newer understanding of how carbon cycles and how organic matter is laid down and how we build soil structure. So our newer understanding around the accumulation of soil organic matter, or the cycling of carbon, is the role of microbes. And when you figure that 20 to 50% of the carbon fixed by photosynthesis actually gets released to the soil through the roots, The thing that we can do most to support the microbes, of course, is to grow more roots. And that's a great way, cover crops are a great way to add that into the rotation. We get more living roots for a longer period of time, and we are seeing some changes in organic matter levels. So here's some work from Dr. Laura Vanier. She's at the Ridgetown campus of University of Guelph. She's got some long-term cover crop work on a fairly high organic matter sandy loam that's in a field crop and hort crop rotation, and where she's growing cover crops as much as possible. And what she's been finding over time is where we've got those cover crops like radish and rye, we are starting to see a significant change in our organic carbon. So it's statistically significant, and that is important over time, but this is a long-term project. It's not something that was seen in a year or two. It was seen over a period of time. And here's more of a summary slide that basically this long-term cover crops in rotation really do build resilience, because we see that increase in organic carbon. We see an increase in overall soil health. She's been measuring soil health in a number of different factors. And what else we see is an increase in crop yields. And that increase in crop yields really is due to increased resilience under dry and hot conditions and, just adverse weather. The challenge is, though, what Laura's working with Richard Vine, who's an economist, looking more tightly at grain and oil seeds and what the cover crops bring in terms of yield within her plot, or vegetable crops within her plot. What we see is that it's not really making us that happy with the grain and oil seeds. We're actually, cover crops are costing us money for the most part, or an absolute break even in something like oats. But for the vegetable crop portion of the rotation, we see a definite increase in marketable yields of a high value crop. So it's very much on the positive side. And Laura's captured this in a number of reports and videos and things like that. The interesting part about that, though, is her more recent work. In fact, the corn yield from this past fall shows that even on our grain yields, time is of the essence. Having enough time of that cover crop in the overall rotation really plays a part in added resilience under really dry conditions like we did this spring and summer. So she saw a significant increase in her corn yield where there were cover crops this past year. The challenge is, though, is that farmers and growers have to pay for those cover crops year by year, and banks like to get paid. So the usual question I get is more along the lines of, okay, so show me the money. How quick am I going to get a return on this? There's some work done by the SARE program in the States that they reported on a couple years ago with this technical bulletin, where cover crops pay their way much more quickly under a few different scenarios. One, with herbicide-resistant weeds, if they're a problem. If we're grazing, if compaction's an issue, if we can use it to ease the transition into no-till, again, think all those extra roots. If soil moisture is at a deficit, so the cover crops are helping to improve soil moisture conditions. If we've got a lot of manure, and we can use that for cycling. The last point, as far as incentive payments, I get that it's going to give a faster return, but really what they're meant to do is support the learning process so that you don't get hurt by it. I wouldn't call it a return per se, but I guess it just makes it balance out a little bit easier. So let's take a look at a few of these. I think one of the critical ones, especially for our field crop or grain and oilseeds growers here, is around cover crops being another tool for suppressing resistant weeds. And this is really important as we're seeing more and more of these come. This in particular is Canada fleabane, or the Americans like to call it mare's tail. And you can see the impact of having a cover crop of cereal rye. And where we've got the rye, the fleabane is smaller, there isn't as much of it, and it's not going to produce as much seed to populate for the next year. Whereas where we don't have the rye, and this is a field with Canada fleabane, the fleabane is much more aggressive. It's going to create a huge seed bank, and that's going to become a problem. There's been some research done on this by Dr. Francois Tardif and Dr. Clarence Swanton with a grad student, Ted Van High, where they looked at rye and herbicides in a no-till situation, and where they compare no rye with rye. And you can see rye on its own, with its allelopathy and its competitive nature, really does a good job of suppressing fleabane, just as I showed you in the previous pictures. But when we add it to the regular herbicide program, we've got that 1-2 punch that's going to keep our herbicide programs lasting a lot longer, and we get pretty much 100% control. And that is critical going forward. So that's a big seller for cover crops right now, is weed suppression. Another way, the fastest way to make cover crops pay, is by grazing or creating stored feed. And we did a cover crop biomass survey this past fall, and based on the responses from that, many of our growers, many of the dairy and the beef producers who are using cover crops, this is why they're using it. And it does make the management a little bit different in how you approach a cover crop that you're going to use for grazing or for stored feed. And let's take a look at Mike Buos's operation. This is a grower I've worked with for a long time. He's near Chatham, so the far southwest of Ontario. Lovely land, incredibly productive land, and all of that generally sees a cover crop. He may broadcast it, he might drill it, he even flies it into standing corn if the conditions allow. And what he's found is that he's seeing soil improvements enough that he's got neighbors who want to actually share land with him. This allows him to get the cattle out grazing in a different area and create a lot more feed. So what he's seeing is he's really decreased his feed costs. He's seen significant improvements in herd health, and particularly in mothering, improved soil quality, and of course yields going up, and like I said, his costs are going down. And he's been doing this for probably 15 or more years. It's a significant part of his operation now. And it's not just the grazing where it works, it's also just in the harvested forage. So this work was done on a variety of locations across Ontario with some on-farm validation, looking at barley, oats, pea forage mixtures. And the neat part about forages from cover crops that are grown in the fall is it's a different kind of forage. It's so growthy and lush. It makes wonderful baleage. I know I've fed my sheep it before, and they got a little too fat on it. So in Ontario, we can make cover crops fit in a lot of different places, and where we've had our greatest success is after early harvested things like our winter wheat, or early vegetables like processing peas or some of the muck crops and things like that. Traditionally, we've done a lot of frost seeding of clover into wheat. That's become a little bit more problematic in recent years as wheat has gone to being more no-till, so we've got a firmer surface. And also because of the herbicide-resistant weeds, we see a number of times where growers really feel they've got to use a more harsh herbicide on the wheat, and that really doesn't allow the clover to come through. There's a good opportunity after corn silage, because typically that is off in September, after seed corn harvest, also in September. Interseeding in seed corn, so this is something that's grown in the southern part of this province. It offers an option because they take out the male, so it offers an opportunity to have a lot more light interception there. We can seed after late summer and early fall vegetables or sugar beets. So in our area, there's sugar beets grown. And early harvest sugar beets typically are often early September or even the middle of August this year. And that allowed for some really spectacular cover crops afterwards. And there's been some good success in broadcasting in standing beans when the leaves are starting to yellow. So you can see in the picture, that's a broadcast application of cereal rye or winter rye into beans. And you can see where my knife is. We've got a certain amount of leaf deposition at that point, but not all the leaves have dropped yet. So we've got some of the seed there. The leaves are going to fall. They'll make a nice mulch, and we'll get better emergence. And that'll allow a bit of time for it to get started before we wait for harvest. It's been more challenging trying to do cover crops as an interseeding into grain corn or soybeans. And the large part of the problem there is just way too much canopy. We just have no light hitting the ground, and the cover crops really can't get established in the growing season. And seeding after soybean and grain harvest is a little more problematic. After soybean harvest usually works out, except in a really wet year. After grain corn, this year wasn't bad, but there have been years where grain corn harvest isn't complete until December or January, depending on soil conditions and things like that. That makes it really problematic. So you need to think about the growth window, the amount of shade, the moisture, and what your seeding options are, because cover crops still need that soil to seed contact to make it effective. Coming back to the goals, you think about what species really fit, and there's lots of different options. We've broken them down based on what they're really good for. And as time goes on, we know more and more about which ones to use where. Something I wanted to bring your attention to, though, was the Midwest Cover Crop Council decision tool. So the Midwest is a series of states plus the province of Ontario. And it actually extends as far west as North Dakota and South Dakota and Kansas. So some of this might be of more interest to you because it is starting to get into growing season and soil types that are a little bit more similar to maybe Alberta. So it's a cool little tool because you start with where your farm is, you select your state or your province, you select a county, and then you're going to get asked your goals. What do you want out of this cover crop? Is it going to fight erosion? Is it going to be for grazing? Are we looking for lasting residue to suppress weeds? Those kinds of things. And then it generates a list. The list has been selected originally by that local state or province and justified or based on research and experience, long-term experience. So we just recently redid the Ontario one, and it is based on research, agribusiness, and farmer experience. And what you get is this chart where it indicates where we're going to get reliable establishment or where we've got some risk to establishment based on it's going to freeze or we're going to have a lack of moisture. The cool part after that, though, is basically you get a spec sheet that indicates how much seed to drop, how deep to plant it, and if there's any potential disadvantages or advantages that you should be aware of and be able to manage it better. Because it does come down to agronomy, and successful cover cropping means you got to pay attention to the details. I love this quote from Lee Brees. He's a consultant in North Dakota, one of my buddies, and he talks about you need to know your details so you have the opportunities to find ways new things can fit in. And it's, yeah, details matter. The reason I have these pictures here, annual ryegrass, cereal rye, up until about a year ago, even now sometimes, I'll get questions about, I want to plant some of that ryegrass. And then you need to ask these other questions about what do you mean? Do you mean annual ryegrass or do you mean cereal rye? Very large difference in how those two crops grow as cover crops, very large difference in their root system, and a huge difference in how we manage them, and any concerns with herbicide resistance. So details matter. And details matter when we start thinking about termination. So I talk about goals and almost immediately, and species, and I almost immediately start talking about termination because you know you've got to get that cover crop dead one way or another. So whether it's going to be winter killed, it's going to be tilled, it's going to be grazed, it's going to be sprayed. You have to have a plan, and I kind of like having a plan B. Seeding the cover crop is also, of course, important because if you don't get a consistent seed placement and you don't get consistent seed across the field, that could be problems later on. And seed to soil contact matters, but you can adjust a little bit based on season, soil type, and what time it is, how much time you've got. Generally with broadcast, we're talking about 10% more seed though. Just want to tell you a quick little story. This comes out of our cover crop biomass survey that we were doing this fall. This is from a field not too far from me. This is a grower I've worked with for a long time. He really is committed to drilling his cover crop as much as possible. This is after a processing tomato field. So he had a pretty early planting opportunity. And he ended up getting tight for time, so he drilled and broadcast in different parts of the field. And this is where they pretty much butt up against each other. So you can see the kind of stand we had. It was planted September 10th and then sampled October 7th. When I did that, I took one of those 1/4 meter squares and I dug up every single plant within it because I wanted to take a look at what kind of depth we were getting. And of course, with the drill, we're getting a very consistent seeding rate. We're getting a very consistent seeding depth. So the development of the plant is very similar. Whereas with the broadcast rye, we've got some real inconsistencies of depth, and you can see that some were planted very deep, and some of those little ones at the bottom you can see were planted very shallow, and then we got dry and they didn't emerge and didn't start growing until much later. So they're quite a bit behind, which makes for real patchwork. And here's what this field looks like now. It's not as big a deal. There's a big difference there, but he's probably going to have no problems managing it come spring. because it has filled in, that's because it was planted in early September. If we were planting in late October and November, it'd be a totally different story, and we certainly wouldn't have much protection. And the whole key here is trying to get your cover crop so you're set up for success in the next crop. So trying to make sure that you've got consistency, because we're already dealing with wet soil, dry soil, light soil, heavy soil, and we've already got a lot of inconsistencies within fields. We don't need our residue to be the problem and to have big bunchy roots and things like that to cause planter problems. Another thing that gets a lot of discussion is around cover crop, one species, two species, or a big mix. What pays? Which is better? Well, generally, if we're looking at mixes, less is more. And I don't mean less species, I mean seeding rates are less. So you have to adjust your seeding rate based on whether you're growing it for a forage or for grazing. That's a totally different seeding rate than if we're just growing it for erosion or soil building and that kind of thing. What I like about mixes is the resilience, because no matter what the conditions are, probably something's going to grow. And that's part of the reason why a lot of growers here put flax in their cover crop mixes, because if we get dry, often flax is one of the first things we'll see. It's a good idea to reduce the dominating species. So anything in the brassica family tends to be dominant because it comes up quickly and it shades everything else out. If we've got manure, we want to adjust our species. So again, we're going to drop back those really aggressive species that are heavy nitrogen feeders, like the brassicas, like radish. And we're also maybe not going to put as many legumes in because they're going to be a bit lazy. The other thing we have to consider with species, with mixes like this, is the pest potential. So there we've got annual ryegrass on the far left coming out into head. That we've seen problems because if you don't get it controlled, then it can come on to be a problem later on in your spring and winter wheat or any of your grasses. And then the field below that is actually a field of corn that was wheat the previous year, had a big multi-mix after wheat harvest with a lot of turkey manure, and then had a number of wheat escapes in terms of sunflower and buckwheat that went to seed and then became problems in the subsequent corn year. So that's always something to keep in mind. So if we want to get the most out of cover crops, there's a few tips that I usually talk about. It comes back to knowing your goal, adjusting the species and the seeding rates. Got to pay attention to the agronomics, the seeding depth, the rate, adjust that. Does it need to have nutrients? Adjusting things around manure application. I generally say start small, but treat it like a crop and put it someplace where you're going to see it every day and potentially be embarrassed by it if it's not well managed. Start simple. We usually try starting with winter-killed species. Yeah, they're maybe not as good for a number of things, but they're often a little bit easier in terms of headaches come spring. Keep it affordable. There's no reason to spend too much money on a cover crop as you're learning to get it under control. And we suggest targeting the early harvested crops. So after the spring grains, the wheat, vegetables, silage corn, things like that. And a real key one is plan your termination and have that plan B. Something else up your sleeve just in case there's a problem. So here's where some more information is available, at least from an Ontario point of view. If you go to the Midwest Cover Crop Council, like I said, there's a number of states represented there: North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, all those are there. What I do want to bring your attention to, though, is the Midwest Cover Crop Council Conference and Annual Meeting. It's being hosted by Ontario this year, February 23rd to 25th, and it's virtual. There's a very small cost associated with. However, the first day, February 23rd, most of that day is devoted to the state and province reports, and those are free to attend, and you might find those interesting to see what kind of research is being done on cover crops not too far away from you.